This next lesson in modern medicine is going to be focusing on the development, it's a treatment, and we're going to be looking at a case study, looking at the development of penicillin by looking at the role of Fleming and Florey and Chain. And penicillin is one of the biggest developments in regards to treatment that we can look at in the modern period. Now, we've already looked at magic bullets. Now, remember, an antibiotic is something that kills the germ without harming the patient. Now, the development of magic bullets was something which actually did harm the patient in places, but it was that trial and error. And what we've got to the stage at in this period is we've got to a stage where we begin testing and trialing medicines before it goes to the population. So what have we looked at so far? Oh, going back. We've looked at chemical antibiotics, we've looked at magic bullets, we've touched upon bacterial antibiotics. We'll just overview what we've done. Now remember, chemical antibiotics are very simply antibiotics that are made from chemicals. A bacterial antibiotic is something that's made from bacteria, mold. Now, all of this couldn't have probably been done without the work of Robert Koch. Now, even though Louis Pasteur found germs, Robert Koch was the individual who identified certain germs that cause certain diseases. So without that identification, we can't actually attack the specific bacteria. Now the antibiotics we've already looked at are firstly Salvarsan 606. Now, the aim of Salvarsan 606 was to kill syphilis. And it started with a man called Paul Ehrlich, who mixed 600 different forms of arsenic, which was a poison, but he couldn't find the correct mixture to kill the bacteria. It was then when a Japanese scientist called Hatta took it up. He found the exact mixture that killed the bacteria. However, it still killed the patient. So even though it killed the patient, there was still some aspect of progress because we had an antibiotic that killed and attacked the germ. You also later on then had a man called in the 1930s, Gerhard Domick, can't speak this morning, who tried out a chemical mix called Penicillin. This was a red dye, and he tried it on mice, which was a very common method when you're trialing antibiotics. This is something that Florey and Chain also did. And what he found was that it killed the bacteria that caused blood poisoning. Now, he didn't try it on humans. The first human he tried it on was his daughter, because his daughter got septicemia. He tried it on her, she was cured, and it was proof of a chemical cure. Now, both Salvarsan and Penicillin was something known as sulfonamide, and drug companies developed this to find cures for other diseases. So it had sulfonamide in it, and it helped develop cures for multiple illnesses, including pneumonia and scarlet fever. So chemical antibiotics are a very key step forward in the form of treatment. But bacterial antibiotics also cause significant change, penicillin being the biggest one of these. Now, what we need to decide by the end of this lesson is, does this man deserve the plaque that he's been given? Sir Alexander Fleming, 1881 to 1955, discovered penicillin in the second-story room above this plaque. Now, there's many arguments in history that Alexander Fleming does not deserve this plaque, but you can make this decision at the end of this lesson. So, Alexander Fleming, there will be some tasks that you can complete to help you with your understanding. Now, Fleming and the finding of penicillin. Now, what we've got to understand is that the finding of penicillin was purely accidental. So who was Fleming? He was a British doctor working at St Mary's Hospital in London, and he had a particular interest in bacteriology. He previously worked in battlefield hospitals during World War I, trying to improve the treatment for wounded soldiers. He was shocked at the number of men who died from simple infections. Now, this encouraged him to go on and do the work that he ends up finding penicillin. So whilst researching substances that might be effective in combating infection, Fleming noticed something unusual in 1928. Now, The key thing that caused a lot of these minor infections was something called Staphylococcus. And Fleming was trying to combat killing the Staphylococcus bacteria. And in 1928, overnight, he left a Petri dish open. And he came back to it, a dirty Petri dish, and it developed a mould which appeared to have killed off the Staphylococcus bacteria growing in the dish. Now, what he noticed is that this mould did not let any of the Staphylococcus bacteria in, so it was killing it away from the potential patient. Fleming tested this mould and identified it as penicillin. Now, the key thing is that Fleming wrote down his findings, but Fleming actually walked away from this because he didn't think that penicillin could kill bacteria in living people. His experiments showed this because apparently when he mixed it with blood, the penicillin became ineffective. However, he didn't try, that was the purest form of penicillin, so he didn't try dilution, he didn't do experimentation, which Florey and Chain did. But he wrote his findings up, but he didn't pursue funding to perform further tests. So Fleming stopped there. The key thing here is that number one, he has identified this bacteria that kills Staphylococcus, penicillin. Number two, he wrote it up, which was important. This was key to the work of Florey and Chain, because without Fleming writing it up, then it could have just been brushed under the carpet and never brought out again. So a little task that you can do to revise this: explain how Fleming helped with the development in penicillin in 5 bullet points. Now remember, in the exam, 3 is the magic number. If you can think of 3 things that Fleming did to help the development of the magic bullet, the penicillin, then you'll be happy, you can get on with that, and you can explain it and get a very good mark in any given question if you've got 3 key facts. So, moving on. Once you've done that task, Florey and Chain. Now, these were 2 individuals who changed the face of treatment by developing penicillin. Now, Florey was an Australian pathologist working in Oxford. His colleague Ernst Chain escaped Nazi Germany where he was a biochemist. Now, whilst carrying out their research into antibiotics, both of these men came across Fleming's findings and decided that the mould, penicillin, should be tested further to see if it can be effective on living patients. Before testing it on patients, though, Florey and Chain tested the penicillin on mice. And what they did was, they split the mice up in 2. They infected half the mice with the Staphylococcus bacteria and left the other half. They tested the mice on the bacteria Staphylococcus in the mice, and it noticed that penicillin was actually killing the infection. The problem was, and this is something that isn't on the PowerPoint, for it to work for human consumption, Florey and Chain had to get to the point where penicillin was diluted enough to be able to make it safe. So they went through the process, they went through the scientific experiments and got to the point where penicillin was potentially safe for human consumption. Now, the problem with penicillin, especially Florey and Chain noticed this, is it was very difficult to produce it in large enough quantities to do a full human trial. But the scientists, both Florey and Chain, did as much as they could to grow as much penicillin as possible using milk churns, bedpans, and even baths. So they had a big job on their hands. But 1941 was a turning point, because Florey and Chain used penicillin to treat a local policeman who developed septicemia, fatal blood poisoning. He got a scratch off a rose bush, and it got the Staphylococcus bacteria inside, and he developed septicemia. Now, when he was treated with penicillin, the policeman actually showed signs of recovery. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough penicillin to keep treating him, and by the end, he passed away. It was obviously very sad that the policeman passed away, but it was a huge turning point for the development of penicillin because it showed that it worked in humans without harming them. So Florey and Chain needed to take it to the next stage. They needed a large-scale factory where penicillin could be grown and extracted on an industrial scale. Unfortunately, this is the time where World War II was happening, and they approached British pharmaceutical companies, but they were too busy producing materials for the war effort. And this is where Florey and Chain got involved with the United States, and they convinced pharmaceutical companies to begin penicillin production. And after a year, the companies had enough penicillin to treat 10 people. As the US government saw the benefits of penicillin, they funded more pharmaceutical companies to mass produce it, leading to 21 pharmaceutical companies mass producing penicillin. Now, by 1943, the British pharmaceutical companies began to get involved when they too started to mass produce the drug. And by D-Day, there was enough penicillin to treat all Allied casualties. And it saved up to 15% of people's lives due to helping with infection. Now, the key thing with penicillin is you take the dose that you're given. Okay, if you went to the doctors and they prescribed you penicillin, you have to take all of the prescription to guarantee that the germ is killed. Okay, if you don't take all of it, then it might damage the germ, but it doesn't get rid of the full bacteria in your body. So, Florey and Chain development of penicillin, they did many more things to take on Fleming's work. The thing we've got to question is, without Fleming, would Florey and Chain have had a job? Probably not. So we've got to think. See, I want you to complete this table. Fleming, what was the achievements of Fleming's work and what were the limitations, what held him back? And then Florey and Chain, what were the achievements of his work and what held them, their work, and what held them back? And there's a question that you can consider. As historians, it's always good to have a little bit of a debate. Fleming, Florey and Chain were jointly awarded the Nobel Prize for the development of penicillin. Do you think it was the right decision? Once you've completed the table, answer that question. Decide whether you think getting a joint Nobel Prize was the correct decision for the development of penicillin. If you pause the video here and see how much you can get into this table, and then we'll go through the answers. So Fleming's achievements. If you've got these, give it a tick. If you've not, add them in. He discovered a mould which killed the Staphylococcus bacterium. He identified the mould as penicillin, and he published his findings. However, he didn't believe penicillin could work to kill bacteria in living people because he mixed it with blood, in test tubes, and he thought it had no chance of being developed further. And he did not seek further funding to carry out further tests. He moved on to other experiments, other projects, and left penicillin alone. Florey and Chain, they tested penicillin on mice. They diluted penicillin to make it safer for animal consumption. Florey and Chain proved that penicillin would work on a human patient. And Florey and Chain also approached British and US companies to mass produce penicillin, which led to there being enough to treat all Allied casualties from D-Day, saving 15% of lives. You could argue that there were limitations because the first patient that used penicillin, the policeman, I believe his name was Alexander Arnold, he died. But you could argue that that was an achievement, the fact that it proved that penicillin worked. It's just about how we look at it. So what do we think? Did they deserve the Nobel Prize, the joint prize? Personally, I think there's definitely merit to that, because without the work of Fleming, without Fleming having an active interest in bacteriology, he may never have come across this finding. Okay? And the fact is that Florey and Chain picked up his work 12 years after developments have been made. They were in a position possibly to be able to take his development further. Who knows? So, which factors allowed penicillin to develop? Now, you might get a really nasty question in the exam. Explain why there was progress in the development of treatment in the years 1900 to present. And I think you have to write about penicillin in that type of question. there's 5 factors that help penicillin develop. First, you've got the government. Without the US government agreeing to fund Florey's research for 5 years, it may never have been able to develop further. On top of this, both the US government in 1941 and the British government in 1943 helped mass produce penicillin, which enabled the soldiers in D-Day in 1944 to be effectively treated. Technology. There were new ways of mass production, storing penicillin, making the drug available in vast quantities. We had, the US and the UK had factories producing thousands of litres of penicillin every day. Technological developments were significant. Individuals, obviously without the work of Fleming, Florey and Chain, is really important. Florey also did something else, which was key. Now, the American government wanted to patent the drug, patent penicillin, which means it would have only been available for a few people. Florey refused to patent penicillin, which means it would be available worldwide, which was a great move because in the long run, it was going to help millions of people rather than hundreds of thousands. Science was also a big factor. By observing penicillin allowed scientists to modify it and attack other types of germs. Now, after penicillin had been developed, it was found that penicillin had different strands that could also be used to treat other forms of illnesses. And penicillin is used quite regularly for a wide range of issues, of health issues. So that was really key, that being able to observe is really important. And attitudes. The need for treatment during the Second World War was vital, as the First World War didn't have the luxury. So because of the Second World War, people were more open to the use of penicillin because of the horrific deaths that many people suffered in the trenches in the First World War. Now, penicillin can be used mainly to treat diseases caused by certain bacteria. It's also used to prevent infections. So if you have a tooth removed, you might be given penicillin to prevent an infection occurring. The development of this drug allowed scientists to begin looking at other molds which could be used to fight bacterial infections such as streptomycin, which was the first drug which helped fight tuberculosis. Once the chemical structure of penicillin was made, then synthetic versions could be made. So alternative fake versions could be made. But what we do need to understand is that penicillin is now, there's some bacteria that is now resistant to penicillin. You've got like a superbug, MRSA, that might be resistant to penicillin. Problem is, if people use penicillin too much, then it gets to the point where their body rejects it and the bacteria can't be killed by using penicillin. And this is why people say that, using antibiotics rarely is sometimes a good thing, because it helps build your body up. So when you do need antibiotics, it can fight the bacteria that is causing you to be sick. Right, that's the end of that lesson on Fleming, Florey and Chain. So actually, let's go back to this. As a final task, write a paragraph on this. Does this man deserve the plaque? Does Fleming deserve the credit for penicillin and the development? Or do you think Florey and Chain should also be granted their names on that plaque? What do you think? If you want to discuss it, or if you want to let me know what you think, pop it on Share My Homework. But that's the lesson today on Fleming, Florey and Chain and the development of penicillin.